In the spring of 1961, Carl Jung sat in his garden in Küsnacht, Switzerland, knowing he had weeks to live. His housekeeper noticed something strange. Jung wasn't afraid. He wasn't sad. He was curious. When she asked him about it, he said something she never forgot. "I'm not dying. The Carl Jung that people knew is simply finished with its task." She didn't understand. How could a man facing death speak about it as if discussing the end of a workday? But Jung had spent 60 years preparing for this moment, not by avoiding death, but by studying it. He had analyzed over 60,000 dreams. He had sat with hundreds of patients in their final days. And he had discovered something that modern science is only now beginning to confirm. Death is not what we think it is, and neither are we. What Jung understood in those final weeks wasn't philosophy. It wasn't religious hope. It was the result of decades of clinical observation, and it carries a message for anyone who feels like something inside them is dissolving, like the person they used to be no longer exists, and they don't know what's taking its place. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 things Jung discovered that most people never learn until it's too late. First, the psychological preparation your mind is already doing, whether you realize it or not. A pattern Jung found in every dying patient he studied and what it reveals about consciousness itself. Second, the 4 unmistakable signs that your psyche is calling you toward transformation, signs most people dismiss or medicate away. And third, the one practice Jung gave his patients that consistently unlocked what he called the self, the part of you that exists beyond personality, beyond fear, beyond death itself. If you've been feeling disconnected from your old life, if your old ambitions feel hollow, if you sense that something is ending but you don't know what's beginning, this is not a breakdown. Jung would say your psyche is doing exactly what it's designed to do. Let me show you what he found. Jung spent the last decades of his life asking one question that his colleagues considered morbid, even unprofessional. What happens to the human mind when it knows the body is failing? He expected to find fear, denial, psychological collapse, the desperate clinging to life that our survival instincts would predict. Instead, he found the opposite. In patient after patient, as death approached, something unexpected happened. The dreams changed. The concerns that had dominated their entire lives, career, reputation, money, what others thought of them, began fading from their unconscious imagery. And something else emerged. Symbols of completion, circles, spirals, mandalas, images of returning home, crossing thresholds into golden light, meeting figures that felt ancient and wise, guides who seemed to know the way forward. Jung documented this meticulously in his clinical notes, his letters, and eventually his autobiography. He wrote, "The unconscious psyche believes in a life after death, or behaves as if it did." This wasn't wishful thinking. This was pattern recognition across hundreds of cases. The same symbolic sequence appeared in patients who were devoutly religious and patients who were committed atheists. It appeared in European intellectuals and in people with no formal education. It appeared in patients who had studied Jung's theories and patients who had never heard his name. The psyche, Jung realized, knows something the conscious mind refuses to accept. He identified 4 distinct stages in what he called the death preparation process. Stage 1. The dreams begin featuring journeys, long roads stretching toward horizons, rivers that need crossing, mountains in the distance. The unconscious isn't telling the person they're dying, it's showing them, symbolically, that a transition is approaching, something is ending, something else is beginning. Stage 2. Guides appear, animals with knowing eyes, wise old figures who don't speak but whose presence feels significant. Jung recognized these as archetypes, universal patterns that exist in the collective unconscious of every human culture. When these figures began appearing repeatedly in someone's dreams, Jung knew they were being prepared, not by their conscious mind, but by something deeper. Stage 3. The dreams become luminous. Patients would describe fields of golden light, cities that glowed from within, figures radiating warmth and welcome. They would wake up with tears in their eyes, not from sadness, but from a feeling they couldn't explain. The dreams felt more real than waking life, more true, more like home. Stage 4. The individual disappears. The person stops dreaming about themselves as a separate being. Their individual identity, all the stories they told about who they were, fades into symbols of unity, circles completing themselves, drops of water returning to the ocean. The ego dissolves, and what remains is pure consciousness, no longer personal, no longer separate, connected to something infinite. Jung wrote, "In these final dreams, the boundaries of the self become transparent, and the patient glimpses what was always underneath, the self, eternal and unchanging." But here's what shook Jung to his core. This process didn't only happen to the dying, it happened to anyone who went deep enough into their own unconscious, through meditation, through analysis, through what he called active imagination. People who had never been close to death began having the same dreams, the same symbols, the same psychological journey. And Jung realized, this is not about dying. This is about awakening. The psyche doesn't wait for death to show you what you really are. It tries to show you your entire life. Through dreams, through symbols, through those strange moments of synchronicity that stop you in your tracks and make you ask, what is really happening here? But most people never hear it. They dismiss the dreams. They explain away the coincidences. They fill every silence with noise. They live their entire lives on the surface, defending an identity that was only ever a temporary structure. And they never realize the thing they're most afraid of losing, the ego, the small self, was never real to begin with. What gives Jung's work its weight is that he didn't just study these transformations from a clinical distance, he lived one, and it nearly destroyed him. In 1913, Carl Jung was 48 years old and at the peak of his professional success. He was the heir apparent to Sigmund Freud, the most famous name in psychology. He had a thriving practice, international recognition, a beautiful home on Lake Zurich, a wife, 5 children. By every external measure, he had arrived. Then something inside him cracked. It began with visions, not daydreams. Visions. Floods of blood covering Europe, corpses floating in yellow waves, voices speaking to him in languages he didn't recognize. Images so violent and strange that Jung questioned his own sanity. He later wrote, "I was living continuously in a state of tension, as if in the midst of an invisible fire." By any modern clinical standard, Jung was having a psychotic break. If he had gone to a colleague for help, he likely would have been hospitalized, medicated, his career ended. But Jung made a different choice, a radical one. Instead of suppressing these experiences, he surrendered to them. He treated the visions as meaningful, not symptoms to be eliminated, but messages to be understood. Every evening after his clinical work, he would sit in his study and let the images come. He recorded them. He painted them. He spoke to the figures that appeared in his inner world as if they were real. For 6 years, Jung lived in this liminal space. Externally, he continued seeing patients and managing his household. Internally, he was undergoing a complete death and rebirth of his psychological structure. His mentor Freud had already cut ties with him. Their split was bitter and public. His colleagues whispered that Jung had lost his mind. His wife Emma feared for his sanity and for the stability of their family. Some days, Jung himself wasn't certain he would make it back. He called this period the confrontation with the unconscious. Later, he described it more simply. "I had to let myself plunge into the depths." The result of this descent was the Red Book, a massive leather-bound manuscript filled with paintings, dialogues, and visions that Jung worked on for 16 years. He never published it in his lifetime. It wasn't released until 2009, nearly 50 years after his death. When scholars finally saw it, they realized Everything Jung became famous for, individuation, the shadow, the archetypes, the self, all of it came from this period. From his own lived journey through psychological death, Jung didn't discover these concepts in academic literature, he discovered them in the underworld of his own psyche, and he emerged with a map for anyone brave enough to follow. This is why his work feels different from other psychology. It carries the weight of experience. Jung isn't theorizing about transformation, he's reporting from the field. In his decades of clinical work after his own transformation, Jung identified specific patterns that signal when someone is ready for this shift. Not everyone experiences them, not everyone is prepared to, but if you recognize these in your own life, something significant is happening beneath the surface. Sign 1. The familiar becomes foreign. You look at your life, the job you worked so hard to get, the relationships you built, the routines that structure your days, and something feels wrong. Not broken exactly, just finished. Like a book you've already read. The things that used to motivate you no longer do. The achievements that once gave you identity now feel like costumes you've outgrown. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections. Your psychic energy is pulling back from external objects because it's needed elsewhere, inside. This isn't depression, though it can look like it from the outside. Depression is the absence of meaning. This is the relocation of meaning. Your unconscious is preparing for a complete renovation, and it's clearing the furniture first. One of Jung's patients, a woman in her early 40s, came to him describing exactly this. She had built a successful career in finance, raised 2 children, maintained a marriage that looked perfect from the outside. And suddenly, none of it mattered to her. She would sit in board meetings feeling like she was watching herself from a great distance. She would come home to her family and feel like a stranger in her own house. Her doctor thought she was depressed. Her husband thought she was having an affair. Her mother thought she was being ungrateful. Jung saw something different. He told her, "You are not falling apart. You are falling together, but into a shape that doesn't exist yet." Sign 2. Solitude becomes necessary. You find yourself craving time alone. Not because you dislike people, but because something in you needs silence. Social situations that used to energize you now drain you. Small talk feels unbearable, not because you've become antisocial, but because you can sense how much of it is performance and you can't perform anymore. You need space to hear something that can only speak when the noise stops. Jung believed this was the self-creating conditions for contact. The privilege of a lifetime, he wrote, is to become who you truly are. But you cannot hear who you truly are if you're constantly performing for others, constantly managing impressions, constantly drowning out your inner world with external stimulation. The craving for solitude isn't withdrawal, it's preparation. Sign 3. Your dreams intensify. You start remembering your dreams more vividly. They become strange, symbolic, emotionally charged. You wake up feeling like you've been somewhere important, somewhere more real than your waking life, even if you can't explain where. This is the unconscious raising its voice. When you're finally ready to listen, it speaks louder. Jung spent years teaching his patients to record their dreams, not to interpret them intellectually like puzzles to be solved, but to sit with them, to let the images work on the psyche the way poetry works, not through explanation, but through resonance, through feeling. If your dreams are becoming vivid and strange, pay attention. Your psyche is trying to show you something the conscious mind, with all its defenses and explanations, cannot see. Sign 4. The question won't leave you alone. There's a question forming at the edges of your awareness. You may not be able to articulate it yet, but you feel its weight pressing against everything you do. It sounds something like, is this all there is? Who am I really? What is this life actually for? This question is the self knocking at the door. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding it. They fill every silence with distraction. They answer with someone else's script, religious, cultural, familial. They stay so busy that the question never has room to fully form. But the question doesn't want borrowed answers. It wants you to answer. And that requires descending into places most people are afraid to go. Sign 5. You feel a pull you cannot name. This is the most important sign and the hardest to describe. You feel drawn towards something you cannot articulate. It's not a specific goal or achievement. It's more like a direction, a sense that there's somewhere you need to go, something you need to become, even though you have no idea what it is. You only know that ignoring it would be a betrayal of something essential. Jung called this the self reaching out, inviting you to stop living on the surface, inviting you to descend. When you feel this pull, you have two choices. You can ignore it, push it down, go back to sleep, return to the familiar life that no longer fits. You can spend the rest of your years wondering what might have happened if you had answered. Or you can follow it, turn inward, face what you've been avoiding, and meet the part of you that has been waiting your entire life to finally be recognized. In his clinical work, Jung developed a technique he called active imagination. It wasn't meditation in the Eastern sense, not about emptying the mind. It wasn't visualization in the self-help sense, not about picturing what you want. It was something more precise and more demanding. Here's how he described it. Sit in silence, not with an agenda, not trying to achieve anything. Just sit and wait. Let an image arise, not one you choose, but one that chooses you. It might be a landscape, a figure, a color, a feeling that takes shape. Then engage with it, not as fantasy, but as reality. If a figure appears, speak to it. Ask it questions, let it answer. Treat the contents of your unconscious as if they have their own autonomy, their own wisdom, their own perspective that might be different from yours. Most people, Jung noticed, either dismiss their inner life entirely, treating dreams and imagination as meaningless noise, or they get lost in it, swept away by fantasy, unable to distinguish imagination from reality. Active imagination requires a third position, engaged but not possessed, present to the unconscious without drowning in it. Jung worked with a successful architect, a man in his mid-50s who came to therapy because he felt hollow. He had built everything society told him to build, the career, the house, the family, the respect, and none of it meant anything to him anymore. He felt like he was watching his life from outside his body. Jung gave him one task: practice active imagination for 30 minutes each day. At first, the architect reported nothing. Restlessness, boredom, the constant urge to check his watch, to get back to real work. His mind kept generating to-do lists instead of images. Jung told him to stay with it. After 3 weeks, something shifted. An image appeared. A dark pool of water in a forest clearing. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meaningful in any obvious way, but something about it felt significant. The architect returned to that pool each day. Gradually, a figure emerged from the water, an old man who never spoke but whose presence felt ancient and knowing. The architect would sit with this figure in imagination and slowly, over weeks, began to feel something change. He couldn't explain it. His external life remained the same job, same family, same house. But his relationship to all of it shifted, the hollowness filled with something quiet and solid. He stopped performing his life and started living it. Jung saw this transformation repeatedly. Active imagination, practiced consistently, creates a dialogue between the ego and the self. The conscious mind learns to listen. The unconscious learns to trust. And gradually, a new center of gravity forms, not in the ego's endless wants and fears, but in something deeper. The woman from finance that I mentioned earlier practiced active imagination for nearly a year. The image that came to her was a door, a simple wooden door in a white wall. For months, she would approach the door in her imagination, but couldn't bring herself to open it. Jung didn't rush her. He told her, "The psyche knows its own timing. Your only task is to stay present." One day she opened it. Behind the door was a version of herself she had forgotten, The girl she had been before she learned to perform, before she armored herself for the corporate world, before she buried her intuition under spreadsheets and strategy. She wept for a week, not from sadness, from recognition, from homecoming. In his last filmed interview, just weeks before his death, Jung was asked directly, "What do you believe happens when we die?" His answer was careful. He said he didn't believe anything. Belief for Jung implied faith without evidence, accepting something because you want it to be true. What he had was different. What he had was experience. "I have treated many old people," he said, "and it's quite interesting to watch what their unconscious is doing with the fact that death is approaching. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going to continue." The interviewer pressed, "But do you believe in God?" Jung paused. Then he said something that has echoed through decades. "I don't need to believe. I know." This wasn't arrogance. It wasn't religious certainty. It was the statement of a man who had spent his entire life exploring consciousness and found, at its foundation, something he could not explain away, something that behaved as if it were infinite. In his final letters, Jung wrote about death with a strange intimacy, not with dread, but with curiosity. He compared the ego dissolving to a wave returning to the ocean, not destruction, but homecoming. He wrote to a friend, "What happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it." On June 6, 1961, Carl Jung died in his home in Küsnacht, surrounded by family. He was 85 years old. According to his own framework, nothing essential ended that day. The structure called Carl Jung, the persona, the reputation, the personal history, the ego that had navigated the world for 8 decades, completed its task. What remained was what had always been there before the structure was built. The self doesn't die. It can't. It was never born. If you've watched this far, something in you responded to what Jung discovered. Maybe you're at the beginning of a transformation you don't understand yet, feeling the first cracks in an identity that used to feel solid. Maybe you're in the middle of one, disoriented, isolated, uncertain whether you're falling apart or finally coming together. Or maybe you're on the other side, looking back at who you used to be and barely recognizing them. Wherever you are, Jung would tell you, trust the process. Not with blind optimism, but with the understanding that your psyche knows what it's doing. It has been doing this for millions of years, long before humans had words for it. The dissolution of the old self is not a failure. It's not a breakdown, even when it feels like one. It's a clearing. The psyche dismantling a structure that has become too small, making room for something larger to emerge. The question is not whether transformation will come. For everyone, eventually, it does. If not through inner work, then through the final transition we all face. The question is whether you will meet it consciously. Jung's final message wasn't about death. It was about waking up before death makes the choice for you. It was about meeting the self, that deeper, quieter, indestructible part of you, while you still have time to let it change how you live. You don't have to wait for a crisis. You don't have to wait for illness or loss or the collapse of everything you've built. You can begin now, with silence, with attention to your dreams, with the willingness to ask the questions you've been avoiding. Who am I when no one is watching? What remains when the performance stops? What is the self trying to show me? If this video reached you at this particular moment, Jung would not call it coincidence. He would call it synchronicity, the unconscious arranging outer events to mirror inner readiness. Something in you is ready, not for easy answers, but for the real work. That's why you're still here. If this shifted something in you, leave one word in the comments. Whatever arises first, beginning, dissolving, returning, remembering, awake, just one word. Not because it matters to the algorithm, because naming your state is part of the work. It makes conscious what was unconscious. It marks the moment you stopped running and started turning inward. And if you want to continue this exploration into Jung's psychology, into the shadow, into the journey of becoming who you actually are, subscribe. There is much more to discover. This is only the beginning. Jung didn't leave us a religion. He didn't leave us a set of beliefs to adopt. He left us a path, a way of relating to our own depths that transforms everything. That path is still open, and the self is still waiting.